Chapter 1. I stared at the soft glow twisting around my fingertips, completely stunned. It took me a moment to process what was happening. My sight had returned. Heart pounding with excitement, I rushed toward the stairs, eager to share the news with Matthew. But as I reached the top of the staircase, I froze. Downstairs on the living room sofa sat two people. One was Matthew Garcia, my husband. The other was Mia Smith, the woman who had always been his true love. It hit me like a punch to the gut. The maid Matthew had hired to help around the house was her, Mia. They were kissing, completely wrapped up in each other, not even bothering to hide it. For a long moment I just stood there, numb. My mind went blank as I watched the scene unfold, the weight of their betrayal sinking in. Finally, I forced myself to move. Slowly, I descended the stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. Matthew must have heard me because he pulled away from Mia, his expression flashing with brief panic before settling into a cold, composed mask. "You're up," he said, his voice casual. "Can you see now?" I glanced at the smudge of Mia's lipstick on his lips and let out a dry, bitter laugh. "Yeah, I can see," I said, my voice thick with sarcasm. If I were still blind, how else could I witness this lovely little scene? Matthew frowned, clearly taken aback by my tone. He opened his mouth, probably to say something, but Mia interrupted him. She stood up and sashayed over to me, her movements slow and deliberate as if she were savoring the moment. With a sickly sweet smile plastered on her face, she leaned in close, speaking just loudly enough for only me to hear. "I've been living here for 5 years now, Chloe," she whispered, her voice dripping with venomous satisfaction. "I was pregnant at the same time as you, remember? Except the kids you've been raising? They're mine. Mine and Matthew's." She paused, watching my face for a reaction, and then added with a cruel smile, "And your little baby? I had it preserved in formaldehyde. Quite the specimen now." Her words hit me like a sledgehammer. My chest tightened, my stomach churned, and before I could stop myself, I shoved her, hard. Mia stumbled back, collapsing onto the floor. I glared down at her, my heart pounding in my chest, my mind reeling from the shock. How could she say something so vile? And worse, how could it be true? But before I could do anything else, Matthew was on me. He shoved me back with such force that I lost my balance. My head slammed into the corner of the table with a sickening thud. Pain exploded through my skull, and I felt the warmth of blood trickling down the back of my neck. I tried to say something, but the words wouldn't come. My vision blurred and the room started to spin. Without so much as a glance in my direction, Matthew scooped Mia into his arms and left, stepping over my crumpled body as if I were nothing more than a nuisance. I lay there, bleeding out on the cold floor, my strength fading fast. And then everything went dark. I was 8 years old when the Garcia family adopted me. Mr. and Mrs. Garcia treated me like their own daughter from the start, and Matthew, their son, was always kind to me, like a protective older brother. By the time I was 18, I realized I'd fallen in love with him. But to Matthew, I was just his little sister. Nothing more. Then he met Mia. It didn't take long for the two of them to fall head over heels for each other. They were inseparable. I'm not sure who told Mr. Garcia about Mia, but when he found out, he was furious. "Break up with that woman," he demanded. "She'll never be welcome in this family. You'll marry Chloe and that's final." That last sentence was all it took to make Matthew hate me. He blamed me for everything. No matter how much I tried to explain that I hadn't said a word to his father, it didn't matter. He slammed the door and left, disappearing for weeks. Mr. Garcia eventually regretted his heavy-handed approach. He swallowed his pride and called Matthew, asking him to come home. Matthew's response? "If Chloe stays, I'm leaving." I couldn't stand the thought of tearing their family apart, so I left. I built my own life, started my own company, and tried to move on. 2 years later, I heard the news. The Garcia family had gone bankrupt, and Mr. and Mrs. Garcia had taken their own lives in despair. Mia left Matthew shortly after, heading overseas to study. She didn't even look back. When I returned to the Garcia family's old home, it was in shambles. Empty bottles and cigarette butts littered the floor, and in the middle of the mess was Matthew, broken, lost, a shadow of the man he once was. Seeing him like that nearly broke me. He had once been so full of life, so driven. Now he was drowning in his own misery. Ignoring my friend's warnings, I gave him $2 million to help him get back on his feet. Later, when he was in trouble again, I risked my life to save him. I lost my sight in the process, enduring years of pain and humiliation, all for him. In the end, he rebuilt his life. He became successful again, rising from the ashes. But just when I thought we might finally find happiness, just when everyone assumed my sacrifices had been worth it, he betrayed me. Not only did he cheat on me with Mia, but he had the audacity to keep her under the same roof, right in front of my eyes. Chapter 3. The next time I opened my eyes, I found myself back in the moment that had changed everything. The day I lost my sight trying to save Matthew. I stood there, disoriented, staring up at the towering office buildings, my mind spinning. It was as if time had rewound itself. Everything felt eerily familiar, yet distant, like a fading memory I was suddenly thrust back into. As I stood lost in thought, a security guard approached, waving me away with an irritated look. "Hey, what are you doing here? Do you even know where you are?" He sneered, giving me a once-over. "Get lost, will you? This place isn't for people like you. If you don't move, I'll have someone throw you out." Snapped out of my daze, I glanced at him, recognizing his face. He was the same as before, rude and dismissive. I let out a quiet, bitter laugh, not bothering to respond. Instead, I turned and walked away, tossing the lunchbox I had been holding into a nearby trash can as I went. I found a hidden spot in the shade, somewhere I could stay unnoticed, and settled in to watch the scene unfold. It didn't take long. Just as I expected, Matthew came rushing out of the office building, moving with that same reckless urgency. He darted across the street, not even glancing at the traffic, his focus solely on getting to the other side. I leaned back, my heart steady, and began to count down under my breath. 3, 2, 1. The screech of tires echoed through the street, followed by the sickening thud of a body hitting the asphalt. The sound of Matthew's body colliding with the car rippled through the air, sending a shockwave through the crowd. I lifted my head and looked toward the accident. There he was, Matthew, lying on the ground, his body twitching uncontrollably. Blood trickled from the corner of his mouth, pooling on the pavement. The impact had left bystanders frozen in shock, too stunned to react. It wasn't until someone screamed, "Call an ambulance," that the crowd finally snapped out of it. People fumbled for their phones, some calling for help, while others predictably whipped out their cameras to start filming. I couldn't help but smile to myself at the thought of Matthew seeing those videos later, if he even made it that far. A cough behind me broke my reverie. I turned, startled, only to see a man I didn't recognize. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding and quickly composed myself. Soon, the wail of ambulance sirens filled the air. Paramedics arrived, swiftly loading Matthew onto a stretcher and speeding him away. The scene was left in the hands of the traffic officers, who began taking statements and managing the chaos. I spared one last glance at the man behind me, and then turned and walked away, trying to stay calm. But I could feel his eyes burning into my back, his gaze making my steps falter. Chapter 4. I had barely made it home and collapsed onto the couch when my phone rang, shattering the silence. I glanced at the screen. It was Isaac, one of Matthew's closest friends. Rolling my eyes, I lazily picked up the call. "Chloe, you need to get to the hospital now," he shouted, his voice panicked. "Matthew's been in a car accident." Before I could even respond, the line went silent. I stared at the phone in disbelief and then let out a long, exasperated sigh. Of course, Matthew's friends were just as dramatic and self-absorbed as he was. It wasn't surprising they'd call in a frenzy without giving me a chance to speak. But now wasn't the time to show my true feelings. There was still a role I needed to play. I took my time getting ready, moving at an unhurried pace. There was no need to rush. After all, I wasn't in a hurry to see Matthew, and I certainly didn't care to pretend I was worried. By the time I arrived at the hospital, Matthew had already finished surgery and was awake. As I stepped into the room, the lights were dimmed, casting an eerie shadow over everything. "Why aren't the lights on?" Matthew's voice was shaky, his confusion palpable. Isaac, who was standing by his bedside, looked uncomfortable. He cleared his throat awkwardly. "The lights are on, Matt. You just can't see them." For a second, Matthew seemed to freeze. Then panic overtook him. No. This can't be happening. I'm not blind. Urgent babylind. Where's the doctor? Get the doctor. I need to see a doctor. From the hallway, I watched as the realization sank in. Matthew was unraveling, losing control the moment he was faced with the possibility of permanent blindness. In the past, I had been blind for 7 long years. 7 years of darkness, of helplessness, of being forced to depend on others. And here was Matthew, barely an hour into his blindness, already falling apart. How would he survive if this was his new reality? I took a deep breath, pushed the door open and stepped inside. The moment Isaac saw me, his face lit up with relief. He looked at me like I was some kind of savior, silently begging me to calm Matthew down. Suppressing the disgust that rose in my throat, I walked over to Matthew's bedside and gently took his hand. "Matthew, it's going to be okay," I said softly, keeping my voice steady. "The doctor said your sight might come back. You just need to rest and give it time." On the surface, I played the role of the concerned wife. But deep down I was hoping, praying, that he would never see again. Matthew clung to my hand as if it were a lifeline, desperation etched across his face. "Chloe, you'll stay with me, won't you? Even if I'm like this, you'll stay by my side, right?" I nodded, offering him a gentle smile as I murmured, "Of course." But behind that smile, all I felt was contempt. Who would stay by his side now? Certainly not me. Maybe Mia, his precious one true love, would come running to his aid. Or maybe not. Chapter 5. Matthew spent an entire month in the hospital before he was finally cleared to go home. The day he was discharged, Isaac showed up with an envelope in hand. "Matthew, here's the invitation you asked for. It's for the CZ Group's event." The moment I heard the mention of CZ, I froze for a second, my mind flickering back to the past. Matthew reached out, fumbling slightly as his fingers brushed the envelope. "Thanks," he muttered, his voice flat. Without further conversation, he turned and headed for home. In my previous life, I remembered this exact moment. CZ had a massive project in the works and they were looking for the right partner. This party was their way of scouting potential candidates. Matthew had been determined to attend, hoping to secure the deal for himself. The thought made me want to laugh. With his current abilities and his reputation in tatters, he was dreaming if he thought he had a chance. The night of the event, I arrived dressed in a deep red mermaid gown, the satin fabric hugging my figure as I made my entrance. Matthew walked beside me, still handsome but with a stark difference now. He leaned on a white cane, his eyes hollow and unfocused as he navigated the room. It didn't take long for the guests to notice. I could hear the whispers spreading through the crowd, like wildfire catching on dry grass. But I didn't care about them. My gaze was already locked on someone else, the woman standing at the center of the room. As soon as I saw her, a genuine smile tugged at my lips. Harper Williams. She caught sight of me and raised an eyebrow, her lips curling into a smirk as she sauntered over, her wine glass swaying gently in her hand. She gave Matthew a once-over, her eyes filled with disdain before turning to me with a mocking smile. "I didn't realize we were letting blind people into these events now," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. Matthew's face darkened instantly, his expression hardening as he prepared to snap back. But before he could say anything, Isaac stepped in, quickly leaning down to whisper in his ear. "That's Harper Williams," he said. "CEO of CZ Group." I watched the exchange and then turned my attention back to Harper. Our eyes met for a brief moment and I couldn't help but smile a little wider. "Oh well. It's been a while, hasn't it?" Matthew, clearly struggling to maintain his composure, forced a strained smile and extended his hand. "Miss Williams, I'm Matthew, CEO of JC Group. It's a pleasure to meet you." Harper didn't even bother to look at him. She kept her eyes on her wine glass, swirling the liquid slowly as she spoke, her tone dismissive. Never heard of you." She barely spared him a glance before turning on her heel and walking away, leaving Matthew standing there with his outstretched hand hanging awkwardly in the air. The crowd around us didn't waste any time, seizing the moment to pile on the humiliation. Tiske, still acting like he's the young master of some powerful family. If it weren't for the $2 million his wife gave him, he'd probably be washing dishes somewhere. Total freeloader. Matthew's face flushed with anger, his hands clenching into tight fists at his side. But there was nothing he could say. Everyone in the city knew the truth. He had only managed to rebuild himself thanks to the money I gave him. Chapter 6. I stood there watching as the crowd tore him apart with their words, but I didn't step in. I wasn't here to save him. Then from somewhere behind the group, a woman's voice rang out, cutting through the noise. "How can you all talk about Matthew like that? He has talent. You just don't see it." I lifted my gaze toward the voice and there she was. Mia. I had been expecting her. In my last life, this was the night Matthew and Mia crossed paths again, the night everything started to spiral out of control. She pushed through the crowd, walking straight to the center of the room. I turned my head slightly, watching Matthew's reaction. His entire body went rigid, frozen in place. I could almost feel the shame radiating off him. He didn't want her to see him like this. Mia rushed over to Matthew, her eyes soft and full of emotion as she reached for his hand. "Matthew," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion, "I'm back." The room fell into a stunned silence. All eyes turned to me and then back to Matthew and Mia. People waited, expecting some kind of reaction from me, but I gave them nothing. I simply looked at Matthew with calm indifference. "Well," I said lightly, "it looks like you two have a lot to catch up on. I'll leave you to it." Without waiting for a response, I turned and walked away, heading towards the exit. Let them talk. Let them speculate. I didn't care anymore. I slipped out of the crowd, making my way through the hotel's corridors until I reached the elevator. I wasn't planning on staying at the party any longer. I had someone I needed to meet. But as I rounded the corner, I accidentally bumped into a man in a sharp, tailored suit. "Oh, I'm sorry." I apologized quickly, taking a step back. I glanced up and for a split second I froze. It was him. The same man I had seen the day of Matthew's accident. The one who had watched everything with those calm, unreadable eyes. He adjusted his gold-rimmed glasses, offering me a polite smile. His voice was smooth, almost disarmingly gentle. "No problem," he said, his tone easygoing. There was something about him, something that made me uneasy. But I didn't have time to dwell on it. Without another word, I nodded and continued on my way. There were more important things waiting for me upstairs. Chapter 7. I opened the door to the private room and there she was, Harper, already seated, casually holding a cigarette between her fingers. She exhaled a slow stream of smoke, watching it curl lazily toward the ceiling. "So, what's the plan? You really going to give up on CZ Group? Spend the rest of your life babysitting that loser?" The same question she had asked me in my last life. I couldn't quite remember how I had answered back then, but I did remember the argument that followed. Loud, bitter, and final. After that fight, Harper and I stopped talking. I distanced myself from CZ Group, letting it run on autopilot, only collecting dividends each month. I hadn't looked back. Thinking about it now, a flicker of guilt stirred in me. I walked over, snatched the cigarette from her hand, and took a long drag before responding. "No. I'm done with Matthew. I see him for what he really is now. I'll handle things here and then I'll come back to take charge of CZ." Harper blinked, clearly not expecting that. She stood up abruptly, staring at me like she wasn't sure if I was serious. "You're not joking?" I nodded, my voice calm but firm. "Nope. Also, cut off all business between CZ and JC. Take back every project we conceded to them, and don't give them another chance going forward." Harper's eyes widened slightly, but then she broke into a grin, clapping me on the shoulder. "Now that's the Chloe I remember. God, these last few years, it was like you were under some kind of spell." I rolled my eyes at her dramatics but didn't bother to respond. She grabbed my hand and dragged me toward the balcony, clearly ready to launch into a tirade about Matthew, her favorite subject of mockery. But just as she was about to start, something caught her eye. She leaned over the railing, squinting toward the hotel's garden below. "What's going on?" asked, curious. Harper pointed toward the fountain, her voice laced with confusion. "Chloe, look over there. Isn't that Matthew?" I followed her gaze and sure enough, there he was. Matthew, locking lips with Mia by the fountain. Without a second thought, I pulled out my phone and snapped a few pictures, the camera's flash cutting through the night air. Chapter 8. Before leaving the hotel, I asked Harper to quietly arrange for someone to tail Matthew and Mia. I needed concrete evidence of their little reunion just in case. When I returned to the banquet hall, neither of them was back yet. Isaac approached me looking slightly concerned. "Matthew left about half an hour ago," he said. "Alfa Noraho? That's interesting considering I'd just seen him making out with Mia by the fountain 10 minutes ago." But I didn't bother to correct him. Instead, I simply nodded and turned to leave. As I was heading out, I caught sight of someone in the crowd. It was him again. In my past life, this man hadn't been part of the picture. Who was he? And why did he keep appearing now? Could my rebirth have altered more than just my own path? Just as I was lost in thought, Harper stepped forward, extending her hand with a polite smile. "Mr. Davis, it's an honor to have you at our company's event. Thank you for coming." Dylan Davis shook her hand briefly and then withdrew with a polite nod. "The honor is mine," he said, his tone neutral and composed. The name tickled something in the back of my mind, but I couldn't quite place it. I glanced back at him as I walked away, trying to remember where I'd heard that name before. Nothing came to mind, but one thing was certain. I didn't know him personally. Shrugging it off, I left the hotel. When I finally got home, Matthew still hadn't returned. No surprise there, he was probably still tangled up with Mia somewhere, doing God knows what. But honestly, I didn't care anymore. Instead, I opened my laptop and started digging into Dylan's background. Dylan Davis, the only son of the Davis family from California. Beyond the basic family details, there wasn't much else. His profile was practically a ghost. It didn't take long to realize that someone had gone to great lengths to keep his information hidden. I sat cross-legged on the floor, staring at the screen. Who was this man, and why was he suddenly orbiting around my world? Before I could dwell on it further, the sound of someone unlocking the front door broke my concentration. I quickly closed my laptop and stood up just as the door opened. Matthew stumbled in, leaning heavily on Mia, whose cheeks were still flushed with excitement. "Chloe," Mia said, her voice soft and sweet. "Matthew had some trouble getting around tonight, so I brought him home. Don't misunderstand, okay?" I raised an eyebrow, my gaze lingering on the fresh hickey on her neck. I didn't bother to respond. Once Mia helped Matthew inside, I shut the door behind them with a firm click, leaving Mia in the hallway without a word. Chapter 9. I helped Matthew to bed, making sure he was settled before heading back to my own room. As soon as I closed the door behind me, I noticed a few unread messages lighting up my phone screen. One of them was a video. I tapped it, and there it was, Matthew half naked, tangled up with Mia. Her blouse was hanging off her shoulders, and it didn't take a genius to figure out where things were headed. The sounds alone, soft moans and breathless murmurs. I quickly paused the video, rubbing my ear as if that could somehow erase the memory of what I just heard. I glanced over at the calendar on my desk, a cold smile tugging at the corner of my lips. Just 3 days left until the 27th, Matthew's birthday, and I had an unforgettable surprise lined up for him. On the day of Matthew's birthday, I made sure the guest list was filled with the city's most powerful and influential people. Politicians, entrepreneurs, socialites, they were all there, thinking they were attending to honor him. Matthew, oblivious as ever, was practically glowing with pride. He truly believed they were there to celebrate his success. He stood at the front of the room, smiling widely as he began his speech. "Thank you all for coming to my birthday celebration. Your presence here," he said, pausing for dramatic effect, "is a great honor to me." He barely finished the sentence when the screen behind him flickered to life. The video, the one with him and Mia, started playing, the explicit sounds of their encounter filling every inch of the banquet hall. Gasps rippled through the crowd, followed by a heavy silence. Matthew's face went pale as the unmistakable noise reached his ears. Mia, standing in the crowd, froze. People began stepping away from her, leaving her standing alone, exposed as the whispers started. Her face drained of color, and she could do nothing but stand there, utterly humiliated. Matthew, though blind, wasn't deaf. He panicked, shouting, "Turn it off! Someone turn it off!" A servant rushed to the side of the stage, ready to cut the video short, but before he could do anything, a calm, authoritative voice broke through the chaos. "Leave it." Every head in the room turned toward the entrance, mine included. Standing there, cool and composed, was Dylan. I froze, blinking in surprise. What was he doing here? He was the last person I expected to intervene in my plans. We barely knew each other. Why would he step in on my behalf? But before I could even begin to process his presence, I noticed 2 other figures standing behind him. And that's when everything slowed to a crawl. The man and woman standing behind Dylan were like ghosts from another world. The man shared more than a few of my features, but the woman, she looked almost exactly like me. The second she saw me, her eyes filled with tears and she rushed forward, grabbing my hand before I could react. "My sister. We finally found you," she cried, her voice breaking with emotion. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. Even I couldn't find the words. I stared at her, completely dumbfounded. You must have the wrong person." I've been in an orphanage since I was 3. The woman shook her head, her grip on my hand tightening. No, we haven't made a mistake. You have a birthmark on your thigh, shaped like a branch, don't you? I felt my heart skip a beat. How could she possibly know that? My mind raced as I looked down, trying to gather my thoughts. She was right. I'd had that birthmark since childhood. At that moment, Matthew, who had been guided down from the stage, overheard the conversation. His voice cracked with desperation. No, that's not true. She's just an orphan, her parents are gone. I crossed my arms, staring at Matthew with a mixture of amusement and disdain. Who told you that, Matthew? Because yes, I do have a birthmark. The woman, my supposed sister, broke down in tears the moment I confirmed it. Before I could react, she threw her arms around me, hugging me tightly. I stood there, frozen, completely out of my depth, my eyes darting to Dylan and the man standing beside him. The man sighed softly, stepping forward to gently pull the woman away. Scarlett, calm down. You're overwhelming her. He turned to me with an apologetic smile. I'm Alexander, your older brother. And this, he gestured to the woman still sniffling beside him, is your sister, Scarlett. We're twins and we've been looking for you for a long time. I stared at them, my mind spinning. Twins? Siblings? I didn't even know what to say. Then from somewhere in the crowd, someone murmured in recognition. Aren't they from the Robinson family? The heirs of the Robinsons from California. The moment that name was spoken, a wave of shock spread through the room. The Robinson family. My mind struggled to catch up. Why had I never heard of them before? Chapter 10. Dylan noticed my confusion and stepped closer, his voice calm but serious. After you disappeared, the Robinson family faced some serious problems. About a year later, they relocated abroad to deal with everything. He paused for a moment and then added, but they never stopped looking for you. That last line hit me like a ton of bricks. I blinked, quickly turning my gaze to Alexander and Scarlett. My whole life, I'd been told by Mr. Garcia that I had been abandoned by my birth parents. If that wasn't true, and then what was? Suddenly, a memory surfaced. Something Mr. Garcia had said long ago. He'd once told me that Matthew could only marry me, no one else. At the time, I didn't think much of it, but now it felt like a crucial piece in a puzzle I hadn't even realized I was putting together. Had the Garcia family always known who I really was? And Matthew, his reaction, his panic, was making me even more suspicious. Without thinking, I stormed over to him, grabbing his shirt collar and yanking him close. My voice came out sharp, almost a growl. Did your father ever leave you any letters? Did he say anything about me? Matthew hesitated, his body stiffening as he tried to maintain his composure. No, he muttered, but his voice wavered just enough to betray him. I narrowed my eyes. It was clear I wouldn't get any answers from him. Right then, Harper appeared, taking in the tense scene before her with wide eyes. She looked like she wanted to ask 1,000 questions but wisely stayed silent. I turned back to Matthew, my voice dripping with cold disdain. Fine. Play dumb if you want. But let me be clear. Those $2 million I gave you to save your company? Consider them gone. You're on your own now. I let the words hang in the air for a moment before I added, and anyone who partners with JC Group from now on? They'll be going up against CZ Group. Scarlett, who had been standing quietly beside Alexander, suddenly stepped forward, delivering the final blow. That also means they'll be crossing the Robinson family. The room erupted into whispers. People began backing away from Matthew as if associating with him had suddenly become dangerous. Within moments, the only ones left standing by his side were Isaac and Mia. Mia's face flushed bright red, but she managed to stammer out something. You're not even the CEO of CZ. What gives you the right to speak for them? I raised an eyebrow, barely able to suppress my laughter. Poor Mia, still as clueless as ever. Harper, who had no tolerance for mistresses because of her own family history, made a show of rolling her eyes as she stepped forward. Who says she's not in charge? You think Matthew got that $2 million from his charm alone? Matthew, desperate now, lashed out with a sneer. That's impossible. She didn't have that kind of money. She was kicked out of the Garcia family when she was 18. Where would she get $2 million? She must have sold herself. That was the final straw. My hand shot out, and before I could even think about it, I slapped him, twice. The sound echoed through the room and my palms stung, but I didn't care. The look of shock on his face was worth it. You really love making up lies, don't you, Matthew? I said, my voice low and dangerous. But now that you mention selling oneself, I think you're pointing fingers in the wrong direction. I turned my gaze to Mia, a slow, cold smile curling on my lips. If we're talking about who's familiar with that concept, maybe you should ask your precious, angelic Mia. Mia went pale, her eyes darting around the room as she stammered, "Why, you're lying." I gave a small nod to Harper and she signaled to someone at the door. A moment later, a large, overweight man waddled into the room, his face lighting up the second he spotted Mia. He was accompanied by a bodyguard, but his attention was solely on her. Without hesitation, the man rushed toward her, arms outstretched. "Babe, I'm Barry. Where have you been? I missed you. Why didn't you come to play with me?" Barry's sheer bulk knocked Mia off her feet, sending her sprawling to the ground. The room fell into a stunned silence, the awkwardness thick enough to cut with a knife. People were now looking at Matthew with a mix of pity and revulsion. Mia struggled to push Barry off her, her face flushed with humiliation. She finally managed to get to her feet, shaking but still defiant. "I don't know him," she shouted, her voice desperate. "I don't know why he's calling me that." I crouched down until I was eye to eye with her, my voice cold and steady. "Are you sure about that?" Mia's eyes flickered with fear and she quickly looked away, unable to meet my gaze. But even then she clung to her lie, her voice barely a whisper now. "I don't know him," she repeated, though the conviction in her voice had vanished. Chapter 11. She wouldn't admit it until she saw the evidence. The bodyguard next to Barry stepped forward, pulling out a marriage certificate from his suit. But it wasn't a domestic certificate, it was from abroad. The registration date was 2 years ago, just days after the Garcia family went bankrupt. I clearly remembered that when the Garcia family went bankrupt, Mia had broken up with Matthew, claiming she was going abroad to study. Looking back now, how laughable it was. The bodyguard opened the certificate and read its contents aloud. Especially the registration date, which he read 3 times to ensure Matthew and Mia heard it clearly. Matthew, in disbelief, tried to grab the certificate to tear it apart but was pushed down by the bodyguard. At that moment, the banquet doors opened again. A woman in a fur coat walked in. Everyone was puzzled about her identity, but Mia's face turned pale and she tried to escape, only to be stopped by the bodyguard. Barry walked over to the woman, calling her Mommy. The woman's expression softened as she patted his head, then signaled another bodyguard to take Barry aside. She then walked over to Mia in her high heels. "You say you don't know Barry, but you can't deny the child at home, can you? That's your child with Barry. And Barry was made this way by you. Have you forgotten?" Mia's face turned ashen, shaking her hands in front of her, her voice trembling. No, it wasn't me. It really wasn't me." The woman's face darkened at Mia's refusal to admit her wrongs. "Take her away." As the bodyguards dragged Mia away, she struggled and pleaded for help. But no one stepped forward, not even Matthew. Matthew sat on the ground, his spirit broken, with only Isaac by his side. Only I knew why Isaac stayed with Matthew. Because Matthew had saved him. But was it possible that someone else had actually saved him? Isaac looked at my meaningful gaze, stunned. "Isaac, are you going to keep following someone who pretended to be your savior?" I raised an eyebrow at him. I remembered that during the Garcia family's bankruptcy, besides me, Isaac was the only one who stayed with Matthew. In my previous life, Matthew had belittled me to make Isaac happy. "I'm not a magnanimous person." I said no more, leaving it at that. Satisfied with the reactions around me, I left. But why were there 3 people following me? I sighed and turned to face them. "Why are you following me?" They shook their heads in unison. "Then go home." Scarlett boldly stepped forward, using her resemblance to me to her advantage, looking pitiful. I heard from Dylan that he saw a girl who looked like me, so I rushed back overnight. I didn't have time to book a hotel. Alexander nodded in agreement. I understood their intentions. They wanted to stay with me. After some hesitation, I agreed. Maybe it was the blood connection, but I didn't feel any aversion to them. In fact, I looked forward to getting to know them. I glanced at Dylan, who smiled warmly. "Where do you live? I'll take you there." I wanted to refuse, but remembering how he had helped me at the banquet, I agreed and invited him for dinner. Chapter 12. As soon as I got home, I received a call from Isaac. This time I didn't answer and even turned off my phone. I cooked a meal for the three of them and they ended up drinking. They stayed the night at my place. Early the next morning, someone rang the doorbell incessantly. Half asleep, I opened the door. Seeing Matthew outside, my drowsiness vanished. I looked at him, annoyed. "What are you doing here?" He stepped forward and grabbed my hand, sincerely apologizing. "Gigi, Yvas wrong. Please forgive me." Seeing that he had regained his sight, my mood soured. I coldly replied, "No," and tried to close the door. But he squeezed through the gap and came in. "Gigi, I really was wrong. Can you give me another chance?" I looked at his shameless face, not wanting to say a word. I walked to the kitchen to pour a glass of water. Upstairs, I heard Dylan's voice. "Gigi, can you get me a new towel?" Matthew's eyes widened, his expression turning angry. He stormed upstairs. Worried something might happen, I followed. Matthew barged into the room, seeing Dylan shirtless, his face darkening. "When did you start seeing him?" I didn't want to explain. After all, Matthew and I were no longer connected. Seeing my silence, Matthew thought he was right. He sneered and continued. "Chloe, let's be honest. Don't you bear some responsibility for my cheating? In the 2 years we were together, you wouldn't let me touch you, kiss you, or even share a room. Do you call that a relationship?" I was speechless at his twisted logic. I looked at him, exasperated. Yes, you're right. So can you leave my house now?" Dylan chuckled, his voice deep and magnetic from just waking up. Matthew, enraged by our behavior, breathed heavily. Dylan looked at Matthew, his eyes full of challenge. "Mr. Lin, aren't you leaving? Or do you want to see more?" Unable to bear it, Matthew stormed out. I looked at Dylan, puzzled. What did he mean by "see more"? Before I could ask, Alexander and Scarlett's voices came from outside. "Gigi, where are you?" I glanced at Dylan, saying nothing. There was a strange feeling I couldn't quite place. Scarlett kept calling, so I quickly went out. After breakfast, I got ready to go to CZ Group. The familiar feeling returned. I pushed open the office door to find Harper sitting in my chair, rocking back and forth. Seeing me, she jumped up and ran over, excitedly sharing the day's news. "Gigi, JC's stock plummeted today. Many companies have terminated their contracts with them. And the Robinson family applied pressure. It's predicted that JC will go bankrupt within a week. Their shareholders are already selling off stocks. Do you have a plan?" "Plan? Since he rose because of me, of course I'd buy the stocks. Letting him go bankrupt now seemed too easy. How could I avenge my child from my previous life?" Chapter 13. I called Alexander, asking him to lift the Robinson family's pressure on JC. Then I saved JC myself. After Harper helped me buy the stocks, she found that I held 50% of JC's shares. More than Matthew's 45%. The company's chairman is usually the one with the most shares. In that case, I wouldn't be polite. I drove to JC Company, seeing the security guard who had once driven me away. He recognized me, frowning and trying to drive me away again. "Why are you here again? Don't think dressing up will get you in. Stop dreaming. Leave." I crossed my arms, looking at him, and said, "You're fired." Ignoring his reaction, I walked into the office building. The JC office was already filled with leaders. Matthew, initially happy about the company's revival, turned pale upon seeing me. "Chloe, what are you doing here? This is an internal meeting." I threw the folder in my hand at him, accidentally hitting his face. I shrugged, apologizing insincerely. He opened the folder, shocked by its contents. "You saved the company?" I played with my fingers, nodding nonchalantly. "Who else? So from now on, important matters should be directed to me, not Mr. Lin." Everyone glanced between us, eventually nodding. Ignoring Matthew's reaction, I got up to leave. Passing by him, I added, "Taking back what I gave you is easy." Chapter 14. I worked at JC for several days, annoying Matthew before remembering the main issue. Why had Matthew reacted so strongly when I asked about his father's letters? There was definitely something fishy. I suddenly remembered a locked metal box in Matthew's room. It must contain something. Luckily, I hadn't had time to throw out his things. I found the box and took it to a hardware store. In less than half an hour, the box was open. Inside was an already open letter. It explained why Matthew had to marry me. The Garcia family had known my true identity from the start but hid me for greater benefits. They planned to have Matthew marry me, ensuring I would always be their daughter-in-law and the Robinson family would support them. I laughed bitterly, realizing Lynn's father and mother had only treated me well because I was useful. Matthew's declaration, "If she's here I'm not," had shattered everything. Heartbroken for their son, they hadn't stopped me from leaving. The bankruptcy was due to Lynn's father and mother trusting the wrong people and losing everything in a major investment. The most disgusting part was the last line of the letter. "If necessary, consummate the marriage by force." I stood there stunned. The seemingly kind Lynn's father had such a vile plan. Feeling nauseous, I couldn't hold back and vomited. Someone handed me a tissue. I looked up to see Dylan again. How was he always around? Anyone would think he was stalking me. Chapter 15. Dylan raised his hand. After a moment's hesitation, I took the tissue, thanking him politely. I didn't want to get too involved with him. His presence was too mysterious. In my previous life, I had never met him. The atmosphere grew awkward, neither of us speaking. Harper's call came like a savior. I quickly answered, stepping outside. She told me Matthew had been taken by the police. I wasn't surprised. From the moment I took over JC and saw the company's finances, I knew this would happen. But I still needed to see Matthew. I returned to say goodbye to Dylan before leaving. But before I could speak, he asked, "Going to JC, CZ, or the police station?" I looked at him, puzzled. How did he know I was going to the police station? Then I understood. With such a big event, he must have known. I wanted to refuse, but Dylan spoke again. "I have some business with him too. Let's go together." Chapter 16. Though I didn't know what business he had with Matthew, his determined look left me no choice. "To the police station, please." "Don't mention it. Let's go." Seeing Matthew, I was shocked. In just a few hours, he seemed to have aged several years. Seeing me, he pressed his hands against the glass, his voice filled with joy. "Gigi, are you here to save me?" I laughed. A man who broke the law, dealing in black market transactions, wanted me to save him? I didn't have that kind of power. Besides, he deserved this. It was his own doing. Matthew noticed Dylan beside me, his expression changing, staring at him. I leaned closer to the glass, meeting Matthew's gaze, and said slowly, "Are you dreaming?" Matthew's face darkened. Then he seemed to remember something, his demeanor turning manic. "Chloe, do you know why Mia and I preserved it in formalin? Because it wasn't mine. It was his." To outsiders, Matthew seemed insane. But I knew he wasn't. He had been reborn too, but his timing was off. He was caught right after. I stood up abruptly, pressing my hands against the glass, wanting to ask more. But the police ended the visit due to his outburst. I slumped in my chair, looking up at Dylan. I expected him to be confused, but he wasn't. He remained calm, though his eyes held emotions I couldn't decipher. I opened my mouth to ask something, but he stopped me. "Let's talk somewhere else." I nodded numbly, following him out. Chapter 17. I looked at Dylan, unsure how to start. Seeing this, Dylan spoke first. "Like you, I was reborn at the same time." He didn't finish, but I understood. He was reborn too. But I still didn't understand why he kept appearing around me. After some hesitation, I asked, "In our previous life, what happened between us that?" Dylan bit his lip, looking embarrassed. "On Matthew's birthday, wasn't the party at that hotel? I was drugged and you were drunk. Somehow you ended up on the 8th floor and entered my room by mistake. And then..." My mind felt like it had been struck by lightning, my eyes vacant. The timing matched. I had always thought it was Matthew. Why hadn't he told me? But thinking about it, he was a prideful man. Admitting it would mean acknowledging he had been cuckolded. No wonder Dylan's name sounded familiar. He had said it that night. Blushing, I remembered everything from years ago. Dylan smiled, asking, "Why are you blushing?" "Nothing. If there's nothing else, I'll go." Unable to face Dylan, I chose to flee. I didn't want to know more. His eyes said it all. Returning home, I calmed down, seeing Alexander and Scarlett. They looked at me seriously, asking my opinion. "Gigi, we want you to live in California. Mom, Dad, and Grandpa are moving back after hearing about you. What do you think?" "We'll follow your lead." I thought about my previous life and decided to go with them to California. For the past few days, Dylan had been trying to see me, but I avoided him. After handling everything in a city, I left for California with Alexander and Scarlett. Upon landing, I saw a familiar face. Dylan stood at the arrival gate, smiling, his eyes locking onto me through the crowd. Silently, he mouthed, Nice to see you again. You won't escape this time. Chapter 18. Dylan's Perspective. At a banquet, I was unexpectedly drugged. Planning to endure it, I was surprised when a woman stumbled into my room. She wandered in and lay beside me. Her scent overwhelmed me. The next morning, seeing her face, I was stunned. I wanted to tell Alexander and Scarlett, but my assistant called about an urgent matter abroad. I left a note with my contact information and left. Returning to find her married to Matthew, I could only watch from afar. I realized I had fallen for her, but she was married. I suppressed my feelings and focused on managing the overseas branch. Returning to find Chloe dead for 3 years and Matthew remarried, I was devastated. Everyone found it suspicious, but no one said anything. I investigated and avenged her, but on the way to the cemetery, I had a car accident. A flash of light and I was reborn. The first thing I did was have someone follow Chloe, creating opportunities to meet her. Eventually, I succeeded in winning her over. She didn't know that after she left a city, I ensured Matthew remained blind for life.